Rebecca Cole had never been one to conform. She didn't attend neighborhood potlucks, had no interest in seasonal decorating contests, and could count the number of words she'd exchanged with her neighbors on 2 hands. Her life ran on her terms, quiet, deliberate, and fiercely private. When she bought her 3-acre lot on the western edge of the estate-style residential development, it wasn't for the manicured sidewalks or community newsletter. It was for the pond, a wide, naturally formed basin left behind decades ago by the removal of industrial rock, its edges thick with reeds and wild grasses, and its waters deep, still, and undisturbed. The previous owner had barely acknowledged the pond, allowing it to become overgrown and forgotten. But Rebecca saw something else entirely. Over the course of 2 years, she turned it into a personal sanctuary, landscaped the perimeter with native plants, installed a small private dock made of cedar planks that she sealed herself, and even added submerged lighting powered by low voltage, solar panels to give the water a soft amber glow at night. It wasn't a backyard amenity. It was a space of intention, a breathing, living part of her property that represented solitude and self-expression. The land was zoned residential commercial, a rare loophole grandfathered in from a past life when the area had supported roadside businesses. Rebecca had taken advantage of that quirk to run her private art and photo venue, where stylists, photographers, and even a few film crews rented the grounds for their projects under tightly managed contracts. She didn't advertise, didn't need to. Word of mouth and exclusivity did all the work for her. Those who came knew they were stepping onto private property, sacred and purposeful. She maintained the space immaculately, with a mixture of stubborn pride and quiet discipline. The signage was clear. Private use only. Access by appointment only. There was no path from the neighborhood's internal roadways. A high perimeter fence bordered her entire lot, with only a single locked iron gate connecting her driveway to the main community street. The pond itself couldn't be seen unless you were already deep within her land, past her home, the sculpture garden, and the winding path that circled the water's edge. Rebecca had carefully kept her world separated from the rest. She paid her dues on time but declined participation in social initiatives, voting drives, and community cleanups. Her mailbox was metal, not HOA-approved beige. Her house was matte charcoal with steel awnings instead of pastel stucco and colonial shutters. She didn't hide her preferences. She simply didn't ask for approval. Despite her detachment, there had never been any real friction between her and the residents, until the summer she mentioned her property in passing during a quiet conversation at a local fundraiser. A new neighbor, fresh from the city and eager to make introductions, had asked about the land. Rebecca, out of courtesy or carelessness, described her pond as a living installation piece, part of a curated ecological space that shaped her venue's appeal. She hadn't realized that the woman's husband sat on the neighborhood committee, nor that her innocent turn of phrase would later be repeated, paraphrased and transformed into rumor by the time it reached the ears of those who had spent years looking for ways to expand the community's shared recreational offerings. It began quietly enough, offhand remarks from neighbors walking their dogs near the property's edge, asking about pond access, or whether she rented it out to locals. Then came the emails, some polite, others passive-aggressive, asking why the neighborhood couldn't benefit from a beautiful natural water feature we're all so close to. She ignored most of them, at first thinking it would pass like every other petty burst of interest in her affairs. But then came the real move. A wooden stake hammered into the edge of her driveway with a laminated sheet clipped to it. Rebecca found it early one Saturday morning as she brought in groceries. She knelt, tore it from the post, and read it slowly, her brow knitting with disbelief. Notice of Community Recreational Designation, the heading said in bold. Below it, in bureaucratic language, the sheet explained that at a recent general meeting, a majority vote had approved the classification of the pond as a shared recreational amenity under Section 9.3 of the Neighborhood Improvement Act. The document stated that, due to the lack of clear boundary fencing, the pond was presumed to be non-exclusive and accessible for the enjoyment and benefit of all adjacent residents. It mentioned maintenance proposals, potential cleanup days, and even vague references to youth kayak programs. Rebecca stared at the paper for a full minute before letting out a breath so sharp it felt like it had punctured her lungs. She immediately walked to her fence line and checked for tampering, but nothing had changed. No new paths had been cut through, no entry points added. But the message was clear. They intended to make her private land into something it wasn't, and worse, they were going to try and use community pressure, technicalities, and red tape to do it. By Monday morning, a few children had already been spotted near her gate, one of them pushing a bike and calling out, "Is this the pond?" An older couple she didn't recognize stood by the fence later that afternoon, peering through the trees and murmuring. Rebecca didn't confront them. Not yet, but the stillness she'd cultivated on her land now felt brittle, like glass held too close to a flame. She spent that night researching, not on forms or in a flurry of paranoia, but carefully, systematically. Property boundaries, servitudes, easement laws. She dug through her deed, her zoning documents, the aerial survey from her initial land inspection, and the covenants she'd received at closing. The pond, she confirmed again and again, lay entirely within her lot. There were no natural runoffs into adjacent properties. No access lanes, no footpaths. It wasn't even visible from the street. But the laminated notice hadn't been a mistake. It had been a message. By the end of the week, Rebecca received a letter in the mail. This one bore a proper header, formatted in the font she had come to associate with every unnecessary neighborhood update. It was from the association chair, a man named Jason Mallory, who had only been in the position for a few months. His tone was polished, diplomatic to the point of insincerity. He thanked her for her ongoing commitment to community integrity and expressed hope that she would consider collaborating on the generous opportunity to turn the pond into a recreational focal point for the neighborhood. He even suggested a planning subcommittee. The signature line was signed in ink with a smiley face drawn beside his name. Rebecca folded the letter neatly and set it aside. She didn't shout, didn't panic, didn't go online to rant. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with a pen and yellow legal pad and began mapping out her response, not just in words, but in actions. Because if they were going to ignore her boundaries, she would draw new ones in something much harder to erase. And, unlike them, she had no interest in compromise. Rebecca's patience, while not unlimited, had always been tightly controlled. She knew how to wait, when to hold back, and how to pick her moments with surgical precision. But there was something uniquely infuriating about the manner in which the situation around her pond continued to evolve. What had started as a passive assertion from her neighbors, wrapped in the artificial sweetness of community interest, had now turned into a persistent and encroaching pressure campaign that eroded not only her privacy but the very principle of ownership. For Rebecca, whose relationship with property was not just legal, but deeply personal and ritualistic, this wasn't simply about water or land. It was about the integrity of her perimeter, the idea that there existed a line no one else was entitled to cross. And now, strangers were slowly stepping over that line as if it had never existed. The following week brought a new level of audacity. Early Thursday morning, while walking back from the mailbox, she noticed a line of small orange flags staked into the grass along the western edge of her property. At first glance, they looked like utility markers, but when she crouched to examine them, she found they carried stickers that read, "Proposed Access Pathway." The markers traced a winding arc that led from the community Greenbelt Trail, which had always stopped at the end of the neighborhood loop toward the rear corner of her land, directly to the pond. There had been no notice, no contact, no question of consent, just flags. Silent, presumptive flags that signaled not only intent, but coordination. She took pictures immediately, walked the full line of flags, and then methodically pulled them from the ground, one by one, stacking them neatly like evidence. As she returned to the house, she spotted two teenage boys on bikes riding slowly past her gate, pointing toward the trees with what she could only describe as casual entitlement. That evening she called her attorney, not the firm she used for contracts and bookings, but a land use specialist recommended to her by a client in real estate development. His name was Darnell Mercer, and he answered her questions before she even finished asking them. Yes, she had legal rights. Yes, the pond was on her property. No, the neighborhood had no claim unless they could produce a valid easement, and even then it would have had to be recorded with her knowledge at closing. And no, a committee vote did not override private ownership, not without a court order, and certainly not without compensation. But Darnell also warned her, in measured tones, that community organizations often leaned into soft intimidation rather than legal confrontation. They don't always want to win in court, he explained. They want to wear you down before you ever get there. That rang true. Rebecca had always understood manipulation as more than just lying. It was about the slow erosion of certainty, making a person second-guess what they already knew was theirs. And now the pressure was mounting in subtler, more maddening forms. Within days of her removing the path markers, she received a notice from the local zoning office informing her that a complaint had been filed against her for unauthorized fencing modifications and restricted access to a shared natural resource. She knew immediately who had filed it. There could be no other source. The irony was staggering. The fence in question had been in place for 4 years, and the only recent modification was the replacement of one broken post with an identical one. As for the shared natural resource, the very idea was an oxymoron when applied to private land. Still, the notice required a formal response, and a hearing was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, the harassment continued, not loud or overt, but quietly insidious. Rebecca noticed footprints along the back fence where the grass had been flattened by repeated treading. A small pile of fast food wrappers appeared one morning near the dock, which had been locked but not sealed. One afternoon, she heard laughter from the tree line, and by the time she reached the edge of the yard, she caught a glimpse of 3 kids scrambling away. It was becoming clear that people had begun treating her pond as public property, despite every sign and barrier to the contrary. When she confronted Jason Mallory by email, outlining the events and requesting a written retraction of the community notice, he responded with a condescending tone disguised as civility. "I understand your frustration, Rebecca," the message read, "but it's important to recognize that natural spaces belong to the spirit of the neighborhood, even when technically located within private boundaries. We are all stewards of the land. I encourage you to consider a spirit of openness." Her reply was brief and surgical. "Legal ownership trumps spiritual sentiment. Your philosophy is not binding." Still, she knew that emails alone would not stop them. She needed to change her posture, not reactive but defensive in the true strategic sense. Darnell helped her file a preliminary injunction to freeze any changes to zoning designations until property boundaries could be reaffirmed. But as the paperwork moved through channels, Rebecca began building out her own defense system, not through aggression, but through presence. She contracted a licensed geospatial survey team to map and stake every edge of her property, with high-visibility boundary tags and metal posts that clearly defined her territory. She installed motion-activated lights at key blind spots along the tree line and set up discrete camera traps, legal on private land, facing out toward the community access areas. And then, with meticulous care, she rewrote her rental contracts to include new legal language stating that the pond and surrounding grounds were under surveillance due to community encroachment attempts, and that any unauthorized presence would result in trespassing claims. For her, it wasn't about escalation. It was about clarity. She didn't want a fight, but if one was forced upon her, she would meet it with facts, infrastructure, and unwavering resolve. Still, that resolve was tested one evening in late June when she returned home from a weekend trip and found the gate to her rear pathway open. Not broken, not forced, just open, swaying slightly in the breeze. A single muddy footprint was visible on the wooden deck near the pond's edge. There was no damage, nothing taken, but the implication was enough. Someone had been there, and they had left a mark, not of curiosity but of warning. That night, Rebecca stood at the edge of the dock and stared into the water, the solar lights casting soft shadows beneath the surface. Her sanctuary had been breached, her perimeter challenged. She didn't feel fear. She felt insulted. Her ownership, her discipline, her silence, all of it had been treated as an invitation by people who saw boundaries not as laws, but as suggestions. And so, she decided, if they insisted on treating her pond like it belonged to everyone, then she would introduce a new element into the ecosystem, something that would make them think twice before stepping into waters they didn't understand. She began making calls the next morning, not to a lawyer, not to the police, but to a wildlife facility in Louisiana that she'd worked with years ago during a photo shoot involving exotic fauna. The conversation was short and professional. Yes, they still offered small-scale wildlife transfers for private ecological projects. Yes, everything was legal with the correct permits. No, the animals in question weren't dangerous when properly managed and contained. And yes, they had a pair of young, non-breeding dwarf crocodiles available, reptiles bred in captivity for controlled environments, small enough to manage, large enough to command respect. Rebecca submitted the paperwork before lunch. The animals would arrive in 10 days. In the meantime, she would prepare the pond, not for a show, not for a spectacle, but as a statement. If the neighborhood wanted wild space, they would have it. Wild, real, and unquestionably private. Let them try to wander in after that. The morning of the delivery was unusually cool for midsummer. Rebecca stood near the edge of her gravel driveway, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, more out of calculated stance than temperature. A white utility van pulled up at precisely 7:45 a.m., unmarked except for a faint Department of Wildlife transfer permit sticker in the lower passenger side corner of the windshield. The driver, a woman in her 50s wearing dark green coveralls and carrying a clipboard, stepped out with a measured expression. There were no greetings, no chit-chat, just signatures, containment checks, and a silent understanding of protocol. The crocodiles were in individual containment crates, low profile, reinforced, and lined with soft but durable foam inside. Rebecca had already designated the shallow end of the pond for their initial acclimation, having prepped the area with natural barriers, logs, and a submerged platform. She had read every regulation, acquired every form, coordinated with her legal counsel, and created a documented log of their transport and habitat configuration. These weren't animals dropped on impulse. They were legal, registered, and included in her new environmental certification proposal as part of a natural balancing strategy. Crocodiles being, in her words, biocontrol agents for invasive frog populations. The phrasing was deliberate. She didn't lie. She simply leaned into the absurdity of bureaucracy in a language it respected. Once the animals were in the pond and the handlers left, Rebecca resumed her usual schedule, but now with a sharper awareness of every movement along the periphery of her property. The next 2 days passed without incident, no visitors, no disturbances, but on the third afternoon, her motion alarms triggered just after 4 p.m. She reviewed the footage on her tablet and saw 3 teenage boys crouching near the back fence. One of them tossed something into the water, a bottle or a rock, it was unclear. Moments later, all 3 ran when the first crocodile surfaced. It didn't charge or roar or react. It simply emerged, calm and still, watching the edge of the pond with those ancient, unreadable eyes. The boys fled. Rebecca didn't report the incident. She simply archived the footage, logged the event, and added it to a private folder titled Examples of Unauthorized Presence. The next morning, she woke to find a printed notice duct taped to her gate. It wasn't on association letterhead. It was typed in bold font on standard white paper and read only, "You're creating a dangerous situation. Remove the animals or we'll handle it." There was no name, no signature, no legal threat. Just an anonymous warning with the flavor of vigilante righteousness. She didn't take the paper down. She laminated it and pinned it inside her entry hallway next to her collection of rejection letters from early in her career as an artist. It belonged in the same category. She was under no illusions that the Crocodiles would stop people for long. The association had too much momentum, and people like Karen Bentley, who had appointed herself the unofficial spokesperson for the people's access to the pond, weren't the type to back down just because things became inconvenient or uncomfortable. In fact, it made them louder. Karen began appearing near the fence almost daily, walking her dog just slow enough to be noticed, pausing for long moments at the spot where the trail now ended abruptly against the newly installed steel posts. She wore designer sunglasses, high-performance sneakers, and that look of self-importance that always preceded a complaint. Rebecca didn't engage. She didn't need to. But the silence seemed to unnerve Karen, and within a week, another escalation followed. A letter arrived by courier, this time from a local attorney representing a concerned neighborhood safety committee, demanding that Rebecca remove or relocate dangerous wildlife from a location proximate to shared community spaces. The letter cited vague animal control regulations, suggested possible liability, and included a list of signatures, some real, some obviously printed without proper witness documentation. Rebecca responded not with a counter letter, but with action. She filed an official notice of animal registration with the Municipal Agricultural Extension Office, then hired an environmental technician to assess her water and soil levels under a new initiative she branded Private Ecological Reclamation Zone. She updated her signage, changed the wording to include live animals, do not approach, protected habitat, and added solar-powered perimeter lights that triggered a low-frequency audio pulse when tripped. Not loud, but enough to make the trespassers uncomfortable. She also installed discrete speaker boxes linked to her cameras, allowing her to broadcast a live verbal warning from anywhere in the house. These weren't gadgets of intimidation. They were tools of stewardship, designed to reinforce what had already been ignored. The land belonged to her, and she was done explaining why. The real turning point came 10 days later when she received a call from Darnell, her attorney. He'd been contacted by a county clerk who informed him that a petition had been submitted to designate the pond as a natural neighborhood asset, under a seldom-invoked land use clause intended for parks and trails. It wouldn't succeed. It was legally flimsy and had no basis in recorded ownership. But it was a signal that someone was pushing hard behind the scenes, using every obscure clause and loophole to force the issue. Rebecca knew who it was. The committee chair, Jason Mallory, hadn't responded to any of her recent inquiries. His silence was strategic. He was letting others, like Karen, make the noise while he operated from behind the scenes, coordinating, drafting, moving pieces. She could feel the rhythm of it. This wasn't about the pond anymore. It was about forcing her into a position of submission, showing her that isolation was weakness, that her resistance could be dismantled by collective pressure, that her silence was a vacuum they could fill with rules and reinterpretations. But Rebecca wasn't isolated. She was prepared. She filed an objection through her attorney within 24 hours, attaching the boundary surveys, animal permits, and photographic documentation of trespassing and vandalism. The filing included a claim for damages if the petition led to unauthorized access or disrupted commercial activities. She sent copies to the city council and to a local environmental nonprofit she had worked with years ago, ensuring visibility from outside the insulated circles of neighborhood politics. The message was clear. She wouldn't be quietly absorbed into their version of compliance. A week later, as the legal gears slowly turned, Karen made her boldest move yet. She arrived at the back fence one evening with 2 other residents, both of them unfamiliar to Rebecca, and proceeded to deliver an impromptu, informational session to a group of curious bystanders. She spoke loudly about safety risks, community responsibility, and toxic personalities who think they're above the rules. Rebecca watched it unfold from her upstairs window, expressionless. She could have called the police. She could have walked outside and filmed them. Instead, she turned on the speakers. Her voice came through them, calm and crisp. "This is private land. You are trespassing. Leave immediately. The area is under surveillance, and your presence has been recorded." Karen stopped mid-sentence, eyes darting toward the speaker, her composure cracking for just a second before she composed herself and walked off, muttering about paranoia and lawsuits. The following day, someone threw an object over the fence. It was a piece of raw meat, wrapped in plastic. Rebecca found it near the pond's edge, untouched by the crocodiles but bloated from water absorption. It was a provocation, a threat, or a prank, maybe all 3. She didn't bother with guesswork. She documented it, logged the footage, and sent the images to Darnell, who filed a complaint under unlawful harassment and attempted animal poisoning. It wouldn't go far, but it was a paper trail, and Rebecca was building a wall of evidence taller than any chain-link boundary could ever offer. She reinforced her fences again, this time with dual-layer steel mesh embedded with vibration sensors. She scheduled a formal inspection by a private security firm, which produced a report concluding that repeated attempts had been made to bypass or damage entry points. She added the report to her case file and had the inspectors return a week later for an evaluation of tampering risks involving small airborne drones. The association may have believed she was being excessive. Let them. In her mind, this was the cost of vigilance. They wanted access, and she wanted proof. It was no longer a dispute about boundaries. It was a matter of control. Who held it, who asserted it, and who bent under it. And if they thought she would bend, they had profoundly misunderstood who she was. By the time that mid-July arrived, Rebecca had shifted from defense to assertion. The lines had already been drawn, legal, physical, and personal, and it was clear that her opposition wasn't going to retreat simply because she'd followed protocol or had legal grounds on her side. No, they wanted a reaction that they could point to, something explosive or reckless that would justify the narrative they'd already begun weaving, that she was unreasonable, volatile, uncooperative. She knew the trap they were setting and had no intention of stepping into it. Instead, she chose control, calculated, strategic, and fully documented. She maintained a precise routine. Early mornings, walking the perimeter, reviewing footage over coffee, responding to every legal notice with silence until Darnell advised otherwise, and continuing to operate her property as a functioning private enterprise, even if her bookings had dropped from the recent tension. She turned down large offers for weekend parties that didn't align with her current risk threshold. She didn't need the money. She needed the space to remain hers, uncorrupted, intact. But her opposition, namely Karen and the other self-appointed community liaisons, weren't idle. They pivoted, cleverly, from direct engagement to regulatory warfare. On a humid Monday morning, Rebecca received a formal inspection notice from the county's Environmental Quality Department. The letter claimed that recent community complaints had suggested the possibility of unlicensed containment of exotic species and unreported environmental manipulation on a body of water exceeding standard residential dimensions. The language was vague and clearly written by someone unfamiliar with her layout, but it held weight because it carried a government seal. Darnell confirmed the visit was legitimate, even if improperly motivated. He advised her to cooperate fully, but document everything, which she did. 2 days later, 2 inspectors arrived in khaki uniforms and clipboards in hand. They were polite but skeptical, clearly briefed on Rebecca as a problem property owner. She led them calmly through the access points, showed them the posted permits for the Crocodiles, the registration with the Wildlife Commission, the documentation of the pond's surveyed dimensions, and even copies of emails with her environmental technician. Everything was current, signed, certified. She didn't allow them to wander freely. Instead, she stayed close, narrating the purpose of each feature. This bench was part of a guest staging area. Those submerged lights were solar-powered and not connected to any grid infrastructure. The Crocs were microchipped and tagged, and their health records were available if needed. The inspectors took notes, asked perfunctory questions, and, before leaving, admitted there were no visible violations, but said a follow-up report would be filed. Rebecca thanked them for their time and closed the gate behind them. The moment they left, she sent the visit summary to Darnell, attached her own audio recording of the interaction, and backed up the footage from 3 different angles. The point hadn't been to find wrongdoing. The point had been to remind her she was being watched. The next escalation came not from the committee or the association's leadership, but from one of the neighbors, an older man with whom she'd had no prior contact. His name was Eugene Talbot, and he approached her one afternoon with a strange mixture of nervousness and entitlement. He claimed to be speaking informally, said he hadn't wanted to get involved, but was just wondering if she'd ever considered installing a small dock on the neighborhood side of the pond to make things easier for everyone. Rebecca didn't answer him directly. She simply turned, pointed to the nearest survey marker, and said, "This is the line. Everything on the other side belongs to me. There is no neighborhood side." Eugene gave a weak smile, muttered something about misunderstanding, and left. But the timing was too precise. Someone had sent him. Whether as a soft probe or a distraction, she couldn't know. She filed a short note in her incident log and moved on. The breaking point came that Friday. Rebecca had left the house briefly to meet with her landscaper, who maintained the grounds around the pond weekly, and when she returned, she found the gate to her main driveway blocked by a parked van. It wasn't a delivery vehicle. It had the association's emblem on its side and 2 uniformed contractors in reflective vests, standing on either side of her property marker with what looked like ground mapping equipment. One of them was holding a clipboard and a rolled blueprint. She pulled in slowly, exited the car, and asked what they were doing. The man with the clipboard replied without hesitation that they were assessing future access upgrades for community walking path expansion. Rebecca said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Then she stepped forward, planted herself between the man and her property, and said in a tone that brokered no discussion, "You are trespassing. Remove your equipment and vacate this property immediately. I will not ask again." The man glanced at his partner, then mumbled that they had authorization from the board. Rebecca didn't blink. "Not from me," she said. "And without my written consent, your authorization is meaningless on my land." She turned, opened the gate, and pointed toward the curb. "Move it." To their credit, they didn't argue. They loaded their equipment, returned to the van, and drove off. She recorded the entire encounter from her porch camera and immediately sent the footage to Darnell, who filed an official cease and desist notice with the board. The footage, combined with the prior events, now established a pattern, not isolated incidents but a sustained campaign of unlawful entry, coordinated pressure, and retaliatory surveillance. That night, Rebecca didn't sleep much. Not from fear, but from the clarity of knowing the game had shifted yet again. They weren't just harassing her. They were laying the foundation for a legal reinterpretation of her property boundaries, a slow, bureaucratic erasure that would rely not on facts, but fatigue. They were counting on her to grow tired, to back down, to eventually concede out of frustration. But they had miscalculated. She wasn't fighting for attention or status. She was fighting to keep what was already hers. She understood now that this wasn't a dispute. It was a siege, and siege warfare wasn't won with speeches. It was won with patience, pressure, and a willingness to go further than the other side thought you were capable of going. And she was very, very capable. Rebecca had grown used to vigilance. It no longer felt like a burden or posture. It had become muscle memory, a reflex she neither resented nor romanticized. Every movement past the edge of her pond, every rustle in the brush line, every unexplained sensor ping was logged, cross-referenced, categorized. She knew the flight paths of the local hawks, the time of day the solar lights activated, and the difference in sound between raccoons knocking over a pot and someone stepping on dry mulch. But knowing wasn't the same as control, and by late July it was clear the people opposing her had adapted. They'd stopped announcing themselves, stopped mailing warnings, and abandoned official letters. The pressure shifted to something quieter, darker, more difficult to confront directly. The first sign came in the form of silence. After the blueprint incident, Jace and Mallory ceased all communication. No calls, no emails, no community updates with passive-aggressive footnotes. That might have seemed like de-escalation, but Rebecca understood what silence meant in conflict. It wasn't withdrawal, it was incubation. In the vacuum of overt actions, strange patterns began to emerge. Twice, someone drove by her house at 3 a.m., headlights off, engine barely audible, slowing just enough near her gate to trigger the driveway sensor before moving on. The vehicle never appeared on community traffic records. Once, her motion camera picked up a figure near the far western boundary, hunched low, possibly carrying something, but the angle was too distant for facial recognition. Another time, one of her security lights was turned sideways, deliberately repositioned, not broken. It was a psychological warfare now, and it was working, not because she was frightened, but because she couldn't trace it to a name or signature. There was no official notice to rebut, no letter to counter, just shadows and suggestion. She reinforced everything, added thermal imaging cameras hidden behind weather-resistant fixtures, upgraded her vibration sensors with multi-frequency sensitivity to detect different weights and movements, installed redundant power systems for every camera node in case of tampering or sabotage. But it wasn't just about security, it was about communication. She wanted them to know she knew, so she had 2 large signs printed, mounted on steel-backed polycarbonate, and placed at either end of her property line. The signs read, "This property is monitored 24/7. Trespassers will trigger automatic legal escalation and wildlife response protocols." The phrasing was deliberate. It hinted at danger without promising it. She had no interest in physical confrontation, but she would use every tool of civil deterrence the law allowed. Still, the provocations escalated. In early August, someone left a small pile of broken glass near the base of her dock, not visible from above, carefully placed underwater, the kind of thing that could shred the feet of anyone who stepped in unawares. Rebecca discovered it during a maintenance check and immediately called her technician to sweep the rest of the pond. They found nothing else, but the implication was clear: sabotage masked as mischief. The following week, someone attempted to disable her infrared cameras using a green laser. The attempt failed. Her system compensated quickly, but it proved that someone nearby understood enough about surveillance tech to start probing for weaknesses. Darnell urged her to file another formal complaint, but the problem was jurisdiction. Without visual confirmation or identification, the sheriff's office logged it as suspicious activity and nothing more. Rebecca didn't push. She knew how systems worked. Unless someone was caught mid-act, there was no leverage to force action. So she made her own leverage. She contacted a former client, an insurance underwriter specializing in high-value properties with integrated wildlife installations. With his help, she rewrote her coverage policies to include language about targeted community hostility and liability countermeasures, a phrase that triggered a higher premium but expanded her legal buffer zone. Now, if someone were to get injured on her land by tripping, falling, or provoking the crocodiles, their ability to sue her was nearly zero. The policy also allowed her to formally designate the crocodiles as territorial biological deterrents under closed-access ecological management, which sounded like a threat but was, in fact, entirely legal. The underwriter had seen worse. "I once covered a guy with an armed peacock," he said with a chuckle. "You're relatively tame." But nothing felt tame when Rebecca woke one morning to find the carcass of a dead raccoon hanging from her gate. It had been strung up by its hind legs, tied with twine, its torso marked with crude slashes resembling arrows. There was no note, no blood trail, just the silent, unmistakable message: "This is how close we can get." Rebecca didn't flinch. She called animal control, had the carcass removed, and submitted the photos and video to Darnell. This time, they filed a formal police report, not because she expected justice, but because she was building a mosaic of harassment that, piece by piece, would eventually become undeniable. Then came the false report. 2 days after the raccoon, a knock at her door interrupted a late afternoon review session. A man in a city enforcement vest introduced himself as a health and safety officer, claimed he was responding to a report that dangerous animals were being kept in unsafe conditions. Rebecca didn't raise her voice. She simply asked for his badge number, requested the complaint in writing, and offered to show him the habitat documentation. He hesitated, glanced around nervously, then admitted the report had been anonymous and unverified. She didn't let him off the hook. She made him call his supervisor, confirm on speaker that there was no standing order for inspection, and then escorted him back to the gate. He apologized quietly. She didn't accept. Not because he'd meant harm, but because he had allowed himself to be used. She wasn't surprised when the local paper, one she didn't even subscribe to, published a small piece 2 days later titled "Private Predator: Community Raises Concerns Over Pond Wildlife." The article quoted several concerned families and mentioned recent government visits, painting her as an eccentric recluse who had turned a neighborhood into a nature reserve. It didn't name her directly, but the implication was unmistakable. Rebecca didn't respond. She didn't write a rebuttal. Instead, she submitted a correction notice through her attorney, demanding a retraction or a follow-up article with factual clarifications about her legal compliance. The editor agreed, but the damage had already been done. Now, even people who had previously ignored the conflict began whispering, watching her with a different kind of curiosity. She saw it in the eyes of the dog walkers, in the sideways glances of passing joggers, in the sudden hesitation of delivery drivers who no longer lingered. But she wasn't alone. Her private security firm, now visiting weekly, compiled an updated dossier of movement patterns, vehicle logs, and thermal anomalies. They flagged a drone flyover that matched the height and angle of someone attempting to film inside her property. She filed a report, and then, for the first time, she went on the offensive. Rebecca installed a laser grid system across the treetops above the pond, a non-lethal, FAA-compliant detection system that recorded the trajectory of any flying object below 200 feet. It wasn't weaponized, but it captured precise telemetry. She also deployed decoys, dummy cameras, mock tripwires, and even fake sensors shaped like motion detectors but emitting no signals. These weren't traps. They were psychological deterrents. She wanted anyone who stepped too close to wonder if they'd been seen, if they'd been marked, if their presence had been cataloged. Most people don't escalate when they think they've been seen. They retreat. But not Karen. Karen returned, this time with a printed petition she waved at the camera demanding citizen access to community resources. She delivered it in person, reading names off the list as if they were warrants. Rebecca let her speak through the intercom, never replying. Karen eventually left the paper on her doorstep, but not before shouting to a small group of neighbors, "She thinks she's untouchable. She thinks we're going to stop." Rebecca picked up the petition, scanned it, and laughed. Half the names were spelled wrong. 3 were duplicates. 1 was a deceased resident. It was amateur pressure masquerading as legitimacy. But, amateur or not, it was persistent. Rebecca met with Darnell in person for the first time since the conflict began. They reviewed everything: footage, letters, timestamps, legal filings. He told her quietly that they were approaching a threshold. One more provable incident. One act of vandalism, one physical confrontation, and they could escalate to a full civil claim with a demand for injunctive relief. She didn't want to sue. She didn't want a payout. She wanted quiet. But Darnell explained what she already suspected. Quiet would never come unless she forced it. Unless the people trying to take from her were made to pay for the attempt. The system only responded to escalation. So she escalated. Not with lawyers. Not with threats. But with presence. She arranged for a wildlife documentary crew to visit the property. Not to film, but to stage. 2 trucks arrived, marked with logos and camera rigs. They walked the pond perimeter, pretended to set up lights, unfurled cables. It was all legal. She paid for the appearance. Karen saw them from her second-floor balcony. That same night, a new anonymous complaint was filed, this time to the FAA about aerial hazards from unauthorized filming. Rebecca didn't care. She'd already filed for the necessary drone permits months ago. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was building a legend. And when you build a legend, people stop asking if it's true. They just start keeping their distance. It happened at dusk, as it so often does when people mistake fading light for invisibility. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and the slow, baked humidity that settles in the evenings before a storm. Rebecca had just finished uploading the latest surveillance data to her off-site archive when the silent alert pinged on her tablet. Motion detected along the western boundary, near the old utility access lane no longer in use. The cameras didn't show immediate activity, but the sensor data was clear. Something heavy had moved past the ground node and hadn't exited the perimeter. Rebecca didn't panic. She didn't grab a weapon or shout into the night. Instead, she initiated a silent sweep of her live feed network, toggling through thermal and low-light filters until she caught it. 2 human heat signatures crouched near the brush line at the far edge of the pond. One was tall, the other shorter, both partially obscured behind low foliage. Neither of them moved with the sloppy randomness of teens or the aimless confidence of joggers. These were adults. Purposeful. Deliberate. Rebecca locked the view, activated the recording override, and marked the feed for legal documentation. She didn't need to guess who it was. The footage showed them carefully cutting through one of the outer tension wires, which, while not electrified, was still private property. They moved in low, using hand signals, as if they thought they were breaching something secure. One of them wore a headlamp, the beam narrow and downward-facing, avoiding direct exposure. The shorter figure reached into a backpack and withdrew something long and cylindrical. Metal or PVC, hard to tell. A few moments later, it became clear. They were attempting to install a motion-triggered noise emitter. Rebecca recognized the model. It was the same kind used to agitate nesting birds. But here, in this context, it had only one purpose: to disturb and unsettle the crocodiles. They weren't just trespassing. They were laying a trap. She didn't call the police. Not yet. Instead, she activated the speaker closest to their location, cranked the volume, and delivered a single clear sentence in a calm, firm tone. You are being watched. Your actions are criminal. Leave immediately and drop the equipment. The taller figure jolted upright, clearly startled, while the other froze. They hesitated, just long enough for Rebecca to tag the footage with time, location, and proximity data, and then bolted. One dropped the emitter mid-run, the other slammed into a low branch, cursed loudly, and kept going. Rebecca tracked them to the point they exited through the same breach they'd created, disappearing into the neighboring yard behind a house she already suspected belonged to one of the petition signers. She locked the footage, tagged it for Darnell, and called her private patrol unit to secure the perimeter and collect the dropped device. By morning, the incident had already escalated into legal action. Darnell prepared a multi-tiered response: trespassing, attempted wildlife harassment, property destruction, and attempted sabotage of licensed ecological equipment. It was no longer a matter of blurry accusations. They had timestamps, faces, infrared profiles, and abandoned hardware. Rebecca filed the complaint through her attorney and notified the city of a formal breach under private land protection statutes. And then she waited. The fallout arrived within 48 hours. Police visited the home behind the breach, and although the homeowner denied knowledge of the incident, a court-issued inspection of the exterior surveillance system revealed footage matching the suspects re-entering the yard just after the event. One of the figures, confirmed as Karen's adult nephew, a temporary resident on her property, was identified by gait analysis and visual comparison. The case moved swiftly, with Darnell pressing for not just a fine or citation, but a protective order. The judge, unimpressed by the neighborhood's recreational grievances, issued a temporary restraining order against Karen's household in relation to Rebecca's property. That alone shifted the entire tone of the conflict. Rebecca didn't celebrate. She didn't call anyone or post cryptic quotes on social media. She spent the day reviewing her landscape files, drafting new maintenance schedules, and sending personal thank you notes to her security team. She knew better than to mistake a verdict for victory. Karen, though silenced legally, still had allies, and the deeper current beneath this conflict hadn't dried up. She saw it in the neighbors who began avoiding eye contact, in the sudden surge of anonymous reviews of her art business that described her as unstable or militant, in the local HOA circular that printed a half-page clarification about personal wildlife enclosures without naming her, but featuring a pond photo suspiciously similar to hers. They were still trying, but they had been dealt a blow, public, formal, and humiliating. But Rebecca wasn't done. She understood that if you wanted peace, you had to build it out of stone, not paper. So she initiated the final phase of her response, an ecological designation submission through a regional conservation trust that would, if approved, reclassify the pond and its surrounding half-acre as a protected private sanctuary. It would place additional limitations on structural development near the water and formalize her right to exclude community development initiatives. The process was exhaustive. Soil analysis, habitat reports, cross-referenced species tracking, but Rebecca had already done most of the groundwork through her prior certifications. She compiled the data, submitted the application, and included a full record of the ongoing neighborhood conflict as justification for ecological preservation. The committee, comprised of external environmental scientists and urban planning advisors, would have no stake in local politics. If they approved the designation, it would become functionally irreversible. And still she prepared for one last lashing. It came in the form of a community meeting. Ostensibly about local zoning updates, it was heavily publicized with flyers featuring cheerful clip art of kayaks and nature trails. Rebecca didn't attend. She sent a representative, a neutral legal observer, to sit silently in the audience and record the proceedings. Karen spoke, of course. So did Jason. They railed against private interests undermining shared space, decried militant overreach, and warned of dangerous precedents. The representative reported back that the meeting was less about zoning and more a public attempt to reclaim narrative. But the most telling moment came when someone from the back, an elderly woman who hadn't spoken much during the past months, stood and asked flatly, "What happens if she wins?" The room went quiet. No one answered, because the truth was, she already had. The following week, the Conservation Trust approved her designation. The pond was now legally protected. Any community initiative seeking to alter, access, or incorporate it would face layers of state-level scrutiny. Karen's influence evaporated. Jason resigned quietly from the committee. The calls, the letters, the flyers stopped. Some neighbors never looked her in the eye again. A few sent short, passive notes of apology. One dropped off cookies with no card. Rebecca accepted none of it. She didn't need closure from them. She had reclaimed it through process, strategy, and relentlessness. Not through spectacle, not through vengeance, just quiet, sustained refusal. The pond remained. The crocodiles, too. And silence, finally, returned to the water. Autumn came slower than expected that year, the heat lingering like a final dare. The trees along the pond's edge began to shift from their thick summer green into bruised shades of copper and deep red, and with the cooler air came a kind of settling, not just in the soil but in the rhythm of the neighborhood. For the first time in nearly 5 months, Rebecca went 3 consecutive weeks without a single incident. No trespassers, no letters, no late-night disturbances or passive-aggressive notes tucked into the gate. The cameras recorded nothing but wind through the reeds, the occasional heron drifting across the waterline, and the twin crocodiles gliding just beneath the surface, silent and unbothered, like guardians too old to care for the chaos of human affairs. The quiet was not trust, it was retreat. Those who had pushed hardest had withdrawn, shrunken by consequence and exposure, while the rest adjusted, recalibrated their understanding of boundaries, and resumed their own lives with that subtle, unspoken admission that things had changed. Permanently. The story of the pond had passed from gossip to myth, from curiosity to a landmark that no longer invited trespass, only whispers and detours. There were no more petitions, no more inspection threats. And although Rebecca continued to log every motion ping and review her footage every morning, it became habit rather than necessity. A routine born not of fear, but of the memory of a fight so intense it had restructured the very ecosystem of her environment. The trust designation was finalized with little fanfare. A simple digital certificate, a short email confirming the listing, and an invitation to attend a future regional symposium on private conservation practices. Rebecca didn't respond. She didn't want to become a symbol or an advocate. She had never fought for recognition. She had fought for peace. Her version of it, carved in isolation, self-governed and built stone by stone with legal filings, environmental reports, and a refusal to yield to the fiction that compromise is always noble. In the weeks that followed, she returned to her work with quiet focus. Her bookings resumed slowly. First a cautious photography team that had worked with her in the past, then an independent art director scouting for a moody, atmospheric location. Word spread that the land was active again, not just legally protected but energetically unbothered. She allowed her calendar to fill in limited blocks, maintaining the serenity that had been so viciously challenged. Clients who came respected the space intuitively. They followed the paths she set, obeyed the rules without needing reminders, and never asked about the signs or the cameras. Most didn't even mention the crocodiles. They simply absorbed the experience and left without disturbing the stillness. One afternoon in early November, a letter arrived, handwritten, neat, and unsigned. It came in a plain envelope slipped through the fence, postmarked from within the neighborhood. The handwriting was steady, the language formal, but tentative. It acknowledged that things had gotten out of hand, that certain voices had spoken louder than others, and that not everyone in the neighborhood had agreed with the direction things took. The writer didn't apologize directly. They didn't admit involvement. But there was a tone of exhausted regret, the kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness so much as distance from blame. Rebecca read it once, then again, and placed it in a drawer without comment. She didn't need it. The war had not been won through empathy. It had been won through discipline and force of will. Still, she didn't destroy the letter. It belonged in the archive, alongside the incident reports, the legal filings, and the photos of footprints in the mud that marked the slow erosion of her boundaries and the long process of reclaiming them. The following week, she walked the entire perimeter of her property just after dawn, a mug of coffee in one hand and her survey maps tucked under the other arm. The air was sharp with cold, the pond steaming lightly in the early light, and the fence posts cast long shadows across the dew-soaked grass. She paused at the southwest corner, the place where the first access markers had been planted without her permission, where children had once stood asking if they could play, where adults had whispered about community space, as if her land was unclaimed simply because she chose not to share it. She stood there for a long while, tracing the edge with her eyes, watching the reeds shift softly in the wind, until the silence folded around her again like armor. It wasn't the same silence she had known before the conflict. It was denser now, earned, a silence that had resisted invasion, endured hostility, and proven that lines drawn with care and defended with conviction could hold, even against the weight of collective entitlement. As she walked back toward the house, her path took her alongside the crocodile zone. The reptiles floated lazily, unbothered by her presence, their heavy forms casting barely a ripple in the water. Rebecca stopped at the edge, crouched, and watched them for several minutes. They were beautiful in their own way, primeval and unmoved by the drama of property lines or whispered resentment. In them, she saw the perfect metaphor for what she had become. Present, powerful, silent when needed, and mercilessly clear about the limits of her tolerance. She hadn't wanted the fight, but once it had come, she had refused to lose. And now the water was hers again. Untouched, unclaimed, absolutely, irrevocably private, and that, she knew, was the real victory. Not that she had won, but that they had finally stopped trying.